regrets prison systems to provide an above minimum living environment to prisoners in welfare states. We call this House to Order, Prime Minister.
Go, Derek! Hi.
Prisons were created to not only isolate criminals, not for the protection of society, but also to give room for every individual to committed a crime to recognize the mistake and give to at the very least to his own in whose discretion to realize the crime that he has committed, for him to realize that it was wrong, and for him to regret finally the crime that he has committed. What's happening in, for example, in such welfare states is when we in fact put him into the same simulated society that we tend to deprive from him, we say that it further harms on what should how should isolation happen, but actually we think that it gives too much premium onto the criminal rather than the system itself. What do we stand for in government bench? We stand for the proper upholding of justice that should always be fair, and not just to the criminals, but also to the ones that have been affected, but also in recognition of what society should owe to that individual. But secondly, we want to prioritize the isolation of that individual for him to recognize over any role of the government to also secure the safety of that individual, but to also secure any kind of things that could be better in the lives of that individual. That's why in this debate, I'm going to discuss two things. Why is this a betrayal to the prisons in prison itself? But second, on how our side, when we such kinds of create a minimum standard, it's going to be better in upholding justice. That's why, let's go to the first argument. Why is this a betrayal to the prison system? And this is where I'm going, because you have to understand on why do criminals, or where do they do these crimes to begin with. It's because we say that there's a different intentions for every individual, right? It might be because of personal needs, or maybe needs that came from their families, or they are forced to do such kinds of actions. But whatever the reason that you might be, if you take a look on the context as to welfare states, where all the systems are already favorable to this individual, such as social opportunities, the lifestyle, the meaning all the things that the government has been provided for you to uphold a better life, for you to be removed from that action to create a crime. But when you decided to commit that crime, we say it's not just a betrayal to the system that offers all the kinds of opportunities to you, but we say but secondly, you also violated the social contract that all the things that the government provide for you, you still chose to do that crime. Please sit down. That's why we say that in prison, in welfare states, it should provide the minimum standard of what should a prison be, and what should the basic commodity is. If you're going to talk to us about on what should the minimum standard be, of it, there could always be different standards. It's already set a precedent for example, in the UN on what should the minimum prison should be, right? But this is where the value comes in, because we say that the value of imprisonment, do you think it's like we should overpower any government role to uphold the liberty of that individual? We say that the primary goal as to when a person is in prison should be the fact that he should react, or should he realize upon himself the kinds of things that he made the wrong, rather than the priority should be on where can that individual best live inside that prison. I'll take you in a few, guys. But so we say that such kinds of when you give him such kinds of above minimum kinds of in the prison system, we think it should always be secondary to the primary goal of rehabilitating that individual. I'm going to discuss later on when you give that above average kinds of things, it disrupts that kind of rehabilitation that can happen. But sure, closing.
Do you also regret this in instances wherein a non-heinous crime was committed?
If that could disrupt the possible individual recognizing that he has committed a wrong, we're willing to say yes to that. But secondly, on why is this important when we discuss justice? Because if you take a look at it, the basic premise is to deprive the liberty of that criminal. You don't deprive that individual when you give him space to actually simulate on what is happening in real life. That's why if you give him a pull for him to anytime he wants, we say that's still similar to the very life that you live, even before you live that crime. That's why we say it's a big injustice, right? For example, if you killed the father of an individual, that family was sit down. That father was killed. But if you take a look at it, his killer is just in the prison system, is just swimming a pool around without even recognizing the same mistakes that he has done to begin with. Second idea, sit down, sir. How are our side it uphold justice better? Because if you take a look at it, when in what is happening now, the justice system is disrupted because you don't anymore deprive the person the basic liberty that should be deprived of him. That's why with such kinds of above minimum facilities, it strictly simulates the same society that should have been deprived from you to begin with. And we say, firstly, that's inconsistency to any prison systems that disrupts the isolation of rehabilitation. But secondly, it adds premium more on the criminal rather than the other factions of the justice system. Sit down, sir. That's why we say, and if you take a look at any regular prison systems in comparison to welfare states, right? People would usually want to go out of that place in any time at any given place. Because in this instance is where you remove him from that ideal life or the basic life that he wanted to live. That's why we say, when you continue to put him in the same life, like for example, in welfare states, it provides, it caters to him on what the kind of life that he's still living is basically the same as normal. But that's why in this debate, the question then becomes on what should the premium be. We say that the premium should be on rehabilitation and balancing the justice system when we get, sure.
There are people who invoke self-defense just that they weren't able to meet the requirements for them to be accepted. Are you saying that these people are inherently bad, that therefore they should suffer in the prison cell with a minimum life?
Because if you take a look at it, in either model, we want to create the rehabilitation for these individuals. But when we create, where do we best get that rehabilitation? Is when we create a facility that is deprived of him, that when he recognizes the same life he's living is not anymore the same as when he committed that crime before. That's why we say that the premium should in this debate should not just be left out on when you value that individual, but it should also be on premiuming on the kind of things that we want to uphold. Like for example, do justice or what should be given to the families of victims, for example. Because in comparing the two models that we have here, if we take a look at luxury model, if we think that in their model, it still simulates the real world, in fact, that should be deprived of him. We think that's an inconsistency when we try to isolate, why we try to isolate him to begin with. That's why for all of these reasons, we're proud to propose in this debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, the idea of rehabilitation, the idea of punishment and penalties to a certain individual is actually a valid neutral argument coming from opening government. Because we are not against the sense of punishment. We are not against the sense of rehabilitation toward these particular prisoners. But the nuance is this. We're talking about welfare states, Mr. Speaker. And when we talk about welfare states, these particular states have their own excess resources coming from their state funds that allows them to forward these types of sense of penal systems. Therefore, if the state could do this, even without compromising other things to the rest of society, the question is, why won't you allow them to do so? What's the clash of opening opposition? The clash is that in welfare states such as Norway, New Zealand, or even let's take the case of US, Mr. Speaker, we are fine with their own ways of creations of prison systems, even if it leads to them experiencing an above living condition, Mr. Speaker, because we think on welfare states have the right to define their own penal systems reflective to one, their economic machineries, and B, their modes of rehabilitation, and thirdly, Mr. Speaker, social realities that exist within those particular states, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to answer two questions on why we think this particular clash punish must be justified. The first is, let's talk about the humanization of lives of prisoners. Why can it go to that particular extent? And secondly, Mr. Speaker, let's try to ask the question, just to become dynamic to Prime Minister's case, let's try to ask, do they really get to be rehabilitated, or is a sense of punishment even existent? Most of the rebuttals will be integrated, except for the salient point coming from Prime Minister saying to us that, well, if you are a criminal and when you committed something bad or against the law, automatically you are a bad person. This is not true. Arnold already raised a POI saying on the principle of self-defense. This things, Mr. Speaker, does not automatically make you a bad person. But secondly, you have several circumstances exempting, justifying, mitigating, Mr. Speaker, that allows you to define and to defend your own self on why you decided to do that crime in the first place, Mr. Speaker. So if these things are existing within the ground and you allow this to make a defense coming from that particular person, you cannot say that they are automatically bad person, and you cannot say that they cannot enjoy the same things that the rest of society enjoys outside of the real world. It's not true that when you say we have to punish someone, you have to remove them from the previous lifestyle that they have. That's why even in the Philippines, Mr. Speaker, we have constant debates saying that we should make our prison cells more spacious. That's why we have basketball courts in those particular prison cells. That's why you still have altars, Mr. Speaker, and members of this house. You still allow them to become human as much as possible, because these are the things to which that person is already predisposed to, Mr. Speaker, and the members of this house. So let's talk about humanization of the lives of prison cells. We agree that they deserve to be punished. We agree that the killing is bad, or doing something against the law is bad, Mr. Speaker. But what we don't agree to is that when a state who understands that they have excess resources coming from state funds should reject prisoners of certain benefits and of certain lifestyles, Mr. Speaker, to what was reflected to the ways of life they had before they were in prison to begin with. The state should recognize that their responsibility should extend to that. Why? Because there is a reason why constant debates on prison rights are continuously fought. There is a reason why states from the third world countries, for example, wants to erase the sardine state space of the size of the prison cells and at least narrow down the harms to begin with. Why? Because the humanization of the prisoner should be reflective to social realities, Mr. Speaker. Because in the outside world, these are the things that they are used to. Why is this nuance very important, Mr. Speaker? Because the purpose of imprisonment is not only for punishment to begin with. It is also about rehabilitation and reintegration back towards your society. You give the people, Mr. Speaker, pardon. You give them parole. You give them even amnesty, or you just put a ceiling on the number of years that they are supposed to be in prison, because the state recognizes and they make a promise of a new life of yours outside the world, Mr. Speaker, and the members of this house. That is why you allow them to let these things be experienced, because once you say that I can give you a promise, Mr. Speaker, you have to tell them that you can experience that, and right now you would be able to adjust to that type of system to begin with. Sure.
Why is it more likely that under your model, reintegration and rehabilitation will happen if they're under an environment that is very, conducive to their healing?
Firstly, that's also your burden. But secondly, Mr. Speaker, we already told you that rehabilitation and reintegration cuts both ways. You have to realize that social realities and reflectiveness towards your status quo, Mr. Speaker, is also very important. But to further answer that particular POI, let's try to answer the second question. Do they really get to be rehabilitated, or even have the sense of punishment even exists, Mr. Speaker? Because government wants us to believe that, well, you are not actually giving individuals to be the leeway to be punished, for example, or you do not allow them to become rehabilitated, or you do not give them the realization that what they think is actually bad. That is completely false, Madam Speaker. Because under our model, you still take away their freedom. You do not allow them to enjoy some civil rights. You do not allow them to constantly have communication to their families in the first place, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. House. You tell us on why that curtailment of rights and of standards is still not enough in a welfare state to begin with, Madam Speaker. You make the prison under your model hate the state more even, Madam Speaker, and the members of this house, because the state right now because the criminals right now would realize that your state has institutional cruelty upon you, Madam Speaker, because that particular criminals knows the capacity of your particular state, Madam Speaker, because these particular criminals are already predisposed to society since the get-go to begin with. So what's the conclusion on this particular argument, ladies and gentlemen? The idea of rehabilitation and the idea of punishment under our side crime, Madam Speaker, can still be accrued to begin with. And if you say that the only way really for us to make them realize that what they did is bad is put them in a prison cell that is not even conducive for living, Madam Speaker, and the rest of this house, we are afraid that when that person goes out of the prison cell, he can retaliate because he knows the capacity of your particular state. Hence, it would result to another cycle of crime within that particular country, Madam Speaker, and the rest of this house. But furthermore, the greatest nuance that they conveniently forget in this debate is that we're talking about welfare states. A state, for example, that has A, the capacity to do this and the machinery to do this, for example, but B, Madam Speaker, has its own definition on what a quality of life is in the first place, Madam Speaker. And if you curtail that and you take that away from that particular prisoner, you are no less than other individuals or other states that imposes upon cruelty upon these people, ladies and gentlemen. With all of these reasons, we are happy to be in the Union Cup finals again.